Yes.
The Cannondale Habit is a name you're likely familiar with, not least because it's the brand's most popular full suspension mountain bike. The Habit has some higher spec models, but this entry-level version is in our Valley Bike field test. What's it all about?
With its 65.5 degree head tube angle, 77.5 degree seat tube angle, and 480mm reach on a size large, the Cannondale Habit 4's geometry is what I would call neutral modern. Nothing too wild in any direction, but kind of what you'd expect to find on a bike with this amount of travel.
The large and extra large frames chainstays are 10 mil longer than the smaller sizes, making them 445 mil total, just for a little bit better balance for the front and rear geometries of the bike.
Yeah, compared to the previous version that we had in the field test a few years ago, this one has a much shorter seat tube length and also is universal derailleur hanger compatible. Again, just kind of modernizing it, updating it for the times.
A revised bike then, even if neutral modern does sound like some kind of colour palette that you might find at IKEA. How does it climb?
I mentioned that modern neutral geometry, and that's kind of how this bike feels in the climbs. You're in a nice upright position, not too stretched out, not too hunched over, just kind of sit and spin and get your way up most things.
As Mike mentioned, that steep seat tube angle is really nice, puts you in a good upright position, which I really liked. The suspension feels fairly supportive, though there are moments where suddenly that support seems to fall away and you're left kind of wallowing deeper in travel. For only being a 130 mil travel bike, that's kind of an unusual characteristic and something that does negatively affect the climbing performance.
Yeah, and there's also those Maxxis Recon tires. That's kind of your typical XC tire. It's a great XC tire, but this bike is a little bit more of a trail bike, or at least it seems like it wants to be. So if you're going up a slippery climb, you just don't have a lot of rear wheel traction and it'll kind of spin and slip out, especially if it's wet or muddy, which has been the prevailing conditions during testing. So that's something that easy to swap out, but it does affect the climbing performance.
Yeah, Bo, the upside to those Recons is the fact that they roll really quickly. So if you're someone who's more preoccupied with the rolling speed of your bike and just want something efficient and speedy, they do provide that, especially because they have a very hard rubber compound. So they'll roll quickly and despite the lack of traction, kind of provide a bit more speed on the climbs because of that.
So the Bellingham boys were impressed with some of the speedy spec choices, even if not universal in their praise of the climbing performance. But how does this bike take the descents? Were there any surprises to be had?
Getting into the descending portions of the Cannondale Habit 4, we're going to talk about what we've been referring to as the trapdoor sensation, which is the sudden loss in support that you get from the rear end of this bike. It feels like you're kind of sitting on a nice neutral support, like as most full suspension bikes should have, but this bike seems to have an inflection point where suddenly you're like very deep in the travel, if not at bottom out, and just kind of leads to some weird erratic feeling rear suspension.
Yeah, I don't have any real complaints about the geometry of this bike. For 130 mil rear travel, 140 fork, it just kind of feels right, what you'd expect. But that geometry almost lets you outrun the suspension. So you start going a little bit faster, start hitting some bigger drops or jumps, you'll find the end of the travel very quickly. And when you do find the end of the travel, you know it. It's not one of those nice, soft, like smooth landings. It's like a
Sorry, it's like what, Kaz? Yeah, thought so.
Like that. That's what happens. The thing bottoms out so hard that it hurts your teeth. And we'll talk more about what we had to do to the suspension, try to stiffen it up a bit more, but overall, it's really not the bike to try to push your limits or try to really charge in technical terrain.
Yeah, in my eyes, it's almost an upside that the fork is worse than the shock. The fork is really quite bad on this bike. So in a way, at least the suspension is balanced. You have a equal
it's a very optimistic
front and rear feel. I mean, it's like, I'm looking at it through rose-colored glasses to a degree, but you do have like a similarly erratic feeling out of the front and rear of the bike.
It's definitely a bike that's kind of more geared towards your casual rider, someone that's out there cruising around on flow trails, kind of green, maybe some blues, but not a bike you would take anywhere near a bike park or anything too wild.
Yeah, I mean, you'll notice it in some of the ride footage, but this was definitely the loudest bike we had on test. A lot of that is coming from the drivetrain. Like the clutch came a bit loose and could be tightened up, but just overall, I think because the rear wheel is moving so much, it claps a lot. There's some cable rattle going on. It's worth noting that Henry Quentin did really like the nicer version of this bike, albeit a slightly longer travel version, but the Habit is a very wide range of bikes, and I think the nicer end ones are quite good. It's just that this suffers from pretty low quality components. One positive aspect that I took away from testing the Habit, and maybe the one positive thing we're going to say in this, is it does corner quite nicely. I think the suspension of this bike may be a weak point, but the geometry is quite good. And that means that you're putting a nice balanced pressure between the two wheels. It handles nicely. Again, like the componentry is holding it back, but I do think the geometry does handle pretty nicely.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, those flowier bits or some bermy turns, you're kind of pumping through. It's a little bit shorter travel bike, but it has a nice, just overall good feel in those sections.
Oh, Dario, ever the optimist. And it's great to see it's a good thing this food has too much sugar, it balances out the fact that it's got too much salt, premise of cooking, taken to mountain bike reviews. But what are the other spec choices like? Are they cooked to a turn, or do they have riders wanting to go à la carte, which I believe is a German saying?
It's going to become a theme to this review, but realistically, the Habit is held back by its part spec. The frame itself is fine, but the things that are hanging off it are not as fine, at least for hard riding or even harder riding. It's not that we were trying to go on the gnarliest trails around, but even for just slightly more technical things, it does become challenging. You have a pretty short dropper post, which is something you can upgrade, but again, it kind of limits you when you're going downhill. This bike has SRAM's level T brakes, which
I personally don't enjoy. I don't think either of us really did. The nicest versions of those brakes are pretty good and well suited to cross-country bikes, but on a trail bike, the low spec T version just don't hold up. You can get them to feel decent at the lever, but they just don't provide any power that's meaningful for a bike that could be fairly capable.
You have that low power, and then you also have those Maxxis Recon low profile tires. It means you're just not really slowing down in a hurry. There are definitely some blown corners or moments you're like, I wish I could have stopped 10 feet back there, but I can't. And those tires, again, they're cross-country appropriate tire spec, but on a bike like this, it's kind of supposed to be a trail bike, so it doesn't really fit. They're mounted to 25 millimeter internal width rims, which means these days a fairly narrow rim. And so the profile, there's just not a lot of support. You need to run a decent amount of tire pressure to avoid burping them, or if you had a tube in there from pinch flatting. So not really the ideal spec.
Yeah, for me, the frustration with the build on this bike is like, in theory, it's suited towards somebody who's getting into mountain biking, and the state of this bike is just gonna make that person feel less confident on the trails. Like for us, like we ride a lot and like can kind of overcome some of those hurdles with the bike, but for someone who's new to the sport or isn't super confident riding technical trails, it's just gonna make things worse.
Wow, that Henry Quinney sounds like he really knows his stuff. And even if this cheaper Habit can sound like a filing cabinet falling down the stairs, who's this bike for? Apart from lovers of thrash metal.
Who's the Cannondale Habit for? In my eyes, it's for maybe your average bike path enthusiast. I know that sounds kind of mean, but honestly, like this bike is quite comfortable. I think the geometry is actually pretty great, but it's so held back by the componentry that you're really just cutting things down to a frame before you could start building them up into something a bit more capable. So as it stands, I'd say it's a good bike for like someone who's doing fitness riding or just wants like a comfortable full suspension to like cruise around on.
Yeah, it's definitely more cruisy. It almost feels like a bike that a bike shop would have in their rental fleet for people that want to kind of go on a rail trail. And I know this is going to sound harsh, but realistically, it's just not really suited for hard mountain biking. But for mellow XC laps where you're just kind of getting out there, don't want to spend a ton of money, don't really plan on pushing things too hard, it does work.
For sure.
But there are limits that come up pretty quick.
Yeah, I mean, like by the end of the riding days, I was like getting used to it, but I don't think getting used to it is like the goal with a mountain bike purchase. You want to have something that you really enjoy riding.
It sounds like this bike is making a habit of offering components that can't keep up with the well-sorted geometry. Let's make it simple though. What are the pros and cons?
We'll start off with the pros of this bike. I mean, realistically, the geometry is the biggest pro. I think that Cannondale did a good job with the updates to it. It has a good modern feel. You're comfortable as far as the overall positioning, but there are some significant cons.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was just like all of the components. It sounds harsh, but like we were thinking through like what we would upgrade first, and on this, it's just kind of like a full sweep.
Yeah, the list gets long pretty quick. Like I'll do this, but then I got to do this and this and this, and then
yeah, which is a bummer because again, like the geometry of the bike is pretty good, but it's held back by the parts.
This is one of those bikes where the entry-level one probably isn't the place to start if you're really trying to get something that's going to last you a while or they'll kind of grow with you. If you can go up a little bit more in price, again, the initial outlay is going to be worth it just because you'll get more adjustments, parts that are better suited to harder riding, and that's what this bike is lacking.
It would even be cool to see like a frame only option. You know, that's not necessarily everybody's top choice for getting a new bike, but again, the frame is solid, the geometry is pretty good, so perhaps that would be a good way to go.
The Cannondale Habit 4 is a bike that could be so much more, if only it wasn't let down by some of its non-starting parts. Whilst this is a value field test, and by their nature these bikes won't be the most expensive ones you can imagine, value doesn't have to mean underperforming. And it's disappointing for our editors to have such a long wish list of potential parts that they'd want to get just to make good on the well-proportioned frame. Thank you for watching the Value Bike Field Test. Be sure to subscribe to Pinkbike so you never miss our latest mountain biking videos.